Welcome to The Drop and our Succession Recap podcast. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell and Meg Watson to break down episode 3 of Succession's 4th season. Boy, that was really something, team.
What an episode. Oh my God. Christ has risen and Logan Roy has died.
We're doing all right, Thomas? You doing okay? You look stressed.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm in the middle of an anxiety attack, but that is therein lies the power of Succession. Yeah, my God, I'm still processing.
So this episode is coming in your feeds a little bit later than usual, and that's because normally what happens is we get the episodes a few days in advance from HBO. That lets us watch them, lets us kind of prepare and record these podcasts so they're in your feeds right when the show finishes. But we found out from HBO at the end of last week, just as we were getting ready to record this, that they would not be sending through any early episodes to anyone in the world for episode 3. We didn't really know why, but there were whispers that it's because something kind of big was going to happen. I started to think maybe this could be the moment where we did see a significant character death. I wasn't entirely sure who it was, but that theory was buttressed by a couple of conversations, Thomas, that you and I had with Nicholas Braun, who plays cousin Greg.
Yes, personal friend of the pod, Nicholas Braun.
Yeah, he's a good friend of the pod now. I ran into him at the Formula One Grand Prix in Melbourne last weekend. We were chatting about the show, and he just brought up, have you seen episode 3 yet? I said, no. He's like, well, my mum watched it, and she called me afterwards and said, are you okay? Is everything okay? And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. But then when we found out we weren't getting these eps, I'm like, oh, okay, something big is happening.
But also, he hadn't watched it, right?
He hadn't seen it yet. At that stage, he'd only seen episode 1. He wanted to wait for them all to come out and binge them all. And Thomas, you've done an interview with Nicholas Braun that we're going to share at the end of this episode. And in that, he mentioned something about episode 3 as well, didn't he?
Yeah, kind of in the middle of our chat, we were talking about, everything that happened so far. And I told him I had been sent the episodes, and he was like, oh, have you seen episode 3? And I was like, oh, no, I've been watching them week by week in order to kind of do this podcast. And it was just something about the way he looked at me and the way he said, have you seen episode 3? At the time, I remember banking it and being like, that was a weird moment. Like something happens there. And then it was like maybe 2 days later, HBO said we weren't getting the screeners. And so that kind of kicked off this, I guess, domino effect of something big happens. And I think in the land of Succession, the only thing that could kind of create such a stone wall of silence would be not even a death of someone, but it has to be Logan's death.
And Meg, we were sort of speculating that would be the case. Even though you had a sense that perhaps this is where things could go, what was your immediate kind of reaction to seeing it unfold on screen?
Yeah, I think we said right at the start of the season, we all expected Logan to die at some point. It's kind of the original premise of the show, who will be his successor. It makes sense to have that as the final moment. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't have expected it to be in episode 3. It's pretty early, but I think it makes sense as well to have that fallout play out over the next 7 episodes. So I wasn't surprised that it happened, but I think I was surprised by the way it did. Not really seeing him fall to the ground or have those final words, it being almost anticlimactic in a way, and just sitting with the kids was just very intense.
Let's dive a bit deeper into that, because this episode had a few different things going on, but really 15 minutes into it, it gets overtaken by Logan's death and the reaction that each of the characters have and the fallout from it. But there were a few bits and pieces, I think, that we need to kind of get out of the way before we get there. So it is called Connor's Wedding, this episode. It is set at Connor and Willa's wedding. We have this interaction between Logan and Roman where Logan basically says, it's time for you to fire Jerry. And I immediately turned to Meg and said, man, I'm glad we picked Jerry Watch. Jerry is popping up big in these episodes. So there are 2 kind of mini plots. There's one which is the wedding. Logan's on his way to Sweden to see what he can do in terms of negotiate with Lucas Matson. And then Roman's job is to fire Jerry. But those things very quickly get overshadowed by the death of Logan Roy, which is relayed to the audience the same way that it's relayed to the kids. We don't see it. We hear about it through a phone call from Tom. We first see Shiv get 2 calls from Tom, which she rejects. She assumes it's probably some business thing or a divorce-related thing. She's at a wedding and she wants to have a bit of fun and not think about what Tom's doing to her. Tom then calls Roman and basically says, hey, your dad's really sick. He's really sick. And that sets off one of the most interesting sequences in, I think, modern television. I don't think I'm overstating it to say that, because it only became apparent to me at the end of the show. But from that moment, from that phone call from Tom to Roman to basically the end of the episode, everything is playing out in real time. Like a minute on the show, it's essentially a minute in the real world. How did you process that, Thomas? What was that like watching that happen?
It felt like an eternity. I was impressed that they managed to do that and that they opted to do that, because it felt like that's what the scene and the occasion deserved. Like, it would have been strange if we were kind of time jumping at all. And because it was such a bomb that went off and there's so much kind of like debris in the aftermath of that. When people, like, as grim as it sounds, when people die, time kind of starts to, when you learn of a death, time takes on like a really strange feeling. That those moments in, like, whether it's a phone call or however you find out, they feel really weird, and it feels like a long time and a short time and all those different things. It's such a specific way that changes, and I'm glad they kind of stuck to that and honored that, because you want to almost like sit in that grief for a bit and be like, what does this mean? And it's a death that has such wider ramifications outside of the family, but just to kind of sit in that initial response, I thought was very smart from Jesse Armstrong, and yeah, it really kind of heightened what could have possibly gone a different way.
It really struck me how much I felt the emotional loss of Logan as a father to the children. I think the show has never shied away from the fact that he's a bad guy, and even in this episode, they remind us of one of the most heinous crimes of Waystar Roco, which is what happened in the Cruisers division. We see Logan immediately before, the last thing we see of him before he dies is him, basically laying out the stakes and saying it's time to, clear the decks. It's time to get rid of these people like Jerry. We hear him say, let's hang cruisers around her neck, right? A reference to the way that they covered up sexual assaults and murders in their company. So we are reminded that, one, he oversaw a series of terrible crimes. Two, he is trying to pin them on his pretty competent CEO as a way to blast her out. Yet when he ultimately dies, and I think it goes to what you were saying, Thomas, because of the way that it's told, the way that it's shot, the perspectives that we see, it's just a reminder of what it's like for anyone to lose their parent or anyone close to them.
Yeah, I think the kids' reactions, and I mean, also we should say how good the performances are from the three kids, especially. I think Sarah Snook in particular does a really incredible job.
Amazing.
And even just the way that those scenes are shot, it's almost like a point of view shot from the phone, and you can see the veins in Roman's head, and the way that Kendall's eyes are like bulging out. It's so intimate, and having that shot in real time, it is so relatable to anyone who's had that kind of moment of, like, when you learn of a death, what are the things that you do? You grasp for the actual facts of the situation. You don't know what to say. And I think the way that these kids are thrown into it is particularly intense for them, because these are people with no real emotional faculty, and they're being asked to say their parting words. Like, it's a difficult thing for anyone to do, let alone these people who've never learned how to express their emotions in normal circumstances.
I thought that whole bit was so amazing. The fact that, there was so much to like unpack there, but the fact that they were forced to say goodbye to their father on the phone while he was on a plane was just like the most Succession thing of all time. And the fact that he wasn't really there anyway, listening to them anymore, as he so often wasn't. And each of their goodbyes I found like so revealing in their own way, like what they each said. And like Kendall was, like wanted to make amends, but there was still like, I think he says like, I can't forgive you. And Shiv is similar. She's like, like she calls him daddy, and she's like, please don't go. But also, what you did was not okay. And it's only Roman who's got like serious head noise from the voicemail he left, that he's the one that's like, oh, you're a good dad, you did a good job. Like, they're all like so deep in their strange kind of fucked up feelings.
Yeah, but even Roman calls him a monster. Like, they're so equivocal in a way, even at that moment of like losing their dad. They're almost trying, each of them, to forgive him and just think about him as a human being who died, but they couldn't quite do it. I also thought, like you, Thomas, that distance, that it's on a plane, we don't see the death, we don't see the body. It's through this mechanism of the phone. It reminded me of COVID in a way. Like, I don't know if any of you lost someone during that period, but it was this really strange moment where if there was someone who was sick, you couldn't really go see them. If there was a death of someone you were close to, unless you were in, the top 5 family or relatives, you couldn't be there. And it was this, it just did such an amazing job, I think, this scene, this whole episode, of making you forget about what any of these characters had done, but just made you think about what death means in like the modern world and how human beings react to it, and what our initial, and then like what you do in the first 30 seconds, what you do in the next half an hour, what you do in the next 3 hours, where there is this combination of grief, and then you kind of make jokes because you've got all this adrenaline and your brain just isn't working properly, and then you just want someone to step you through every single thing that happened because you think if you can understand it, you can stop it, or you can
control it or something.
Control, that desire for control is really interesting.
And I think it, especially with them, strips them of any power or privilege that they have in every other situation. You see Kendall going into like deal mode, and he's like, let's get the best airplane doctor. That's not a thing, and you can't get them up there. And even just, they're trapped on a boat. He's trapped in the sky. There's literally nothing that their money can do. There's nothing that their influence can do or their connections. They're just people who can't do anything.
Let's talk about the reactions that different characters had to this moment. I mean, I think we will get to the earth-shattering consequences for it for the rest of the show. But just in that moment, I thought it was so interesting how many different characters we do see, and how many different characters who normally maybe get 1 or 2 lines got quite a few lines and got quite a bit of screen time and quite a bit of camera time. I'm talking about the Franks, the Carls, the Carolinas, the Jerrys. And I thought it was really deliberate to construct this division between the siblings just being in grief and really struggling with what to do, while that kind of top tier Waystar Roku executives on this plane are immediately going into a kind of a decision-making mode, basically. They're like, we've got to draft this, we've got to prepare for this, the markets are open, we've got to make all of these decisions. And every time the siblings are being asked to weigh in or provide some perspective, they just say they don't want to deal with it. And I'm in 2 minds about this. I'm really interested to get both of your perspectives on this, because on one hand, these kids have just lost their dad. The idea that they should be forced to make tough business decisions about what kind of statement should be sent out and when it should be sent out seems deeply unfair. But there are also siblings who want to run one of the biggest and most powerful corporations in the world. And it's so clear at that moment, yet again, there's gap between who they think they are, these ruthless business operators, versus what they actually are, which is just these kids who don't really know what their relationship with their father is like. And you've got Frank and Carl saying, we've known him for 40 years. We've known him longer than you've been alive. We're sad too, but we know what to do next. Am I being too harsh on the kids, Meg, for them not knowing how to actually respond to this in a business sense?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, at that point, if we're thinking about it in real time, it's been like 10 minutes since they've learned their dad's dead. So it does feel callous to have to jump on it. And someone like Carolina has a lot more space and mental clarity to be able to do that. I think it's also a bit complicated because the people on that plane know the statement they have to put out. They know what's going to help with them in their position. The kids didn't know where they stood with the company as it is. And so now they have to pick a side. And so it's not enough that they're just dealing with the grief of their dad passing. They need to know, am I in ATN? Am I outside of it? It's true that they want to be killers and run their own media companies, but they didn't want to run this one. They were going to go run Pierce. Is that still in the air? I think there's a lot for them to consider in that really short amount of time. And I understand Shiv's impulse to keep the plane in the air, but
yeah, that was an extraordinary debate. Do we keep it up? How does that make us look? What did you think about those differences in reactions, Thomas?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I actually thought that even the people on the plane, it's rare for Succession to get anything wrong. So Jesse Armstrong, if you're listening, I love you, big fan. But I think that I was surprised. We work in the news business. I'm a news guy, but we have obituaries ready to go.
We get quotes and we kick ass.
Yeah, exactly. As Greg reminds us what journalism is. No, but we have obituaries ready to go. We have a plan for when famous people die. Are you telling me that the top tier of Waystar weren't more prepared for Logan, a CEO or the owner of this enormous conglomerate with a history of health problems? They weren't more prepared for an action plan to action.
I always believe that though, because look at how paranoid Logan was when he thought Jerry was one move ahead. If someone was drafting an obituary, he'd be like, you're fucking out of here.
Yeah, I guess. But you think there'd be like more of a process when it is such a big company that, you know, the death of Logan is going to have like cause the stock market to crash. Yeah. Whereas the guys in the plane were a bit like, oh, we should probably put a statement together. And then the kids are obviously still reeling from the death. And I mean, yeah, like Meg said, I don't think it's fair that they should spring into action stations. They do kind of get there at the normal time. Like, I thought it was interesting that Kendall made that kind of semi-speech where he's basically like, look, this, whatever we do will always be what we did on the day our father died. So like that will, everything we do today will have ramifications down the line. I just more thought, yeah, I was surprised that it seemed a bit, they were all a bit out of loss of what to do when Logan dies, as opposed to someone really stepping in and being like, okay, this is what happens now. This is the statement that goes out. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it does feel on one hand a bit odd that there isn't a kind of like emergency break glass, here's the plan. But I think it speaks to the fact that because, as Meg said, Logan was so paranoid and he kept everyone in the dark and there is no obvious successor, when you remove that person who was the center of gravity, you are left with everyone scrambling to figure out what to do. And they coalesce in kind of unusual ways. Well, the siblings coalesce because they're physically together and that they've got this shared sense of loss because it's their dad. But we've never really seen all those business people kind of team up as quickly as they did. They've normally been in sort of different factions. But a couple of things quickly emerged. Carrie is like persona non grata. Like, she's done. It's like,
loved that.
Get out of here.
I was all about that. How quickly she fell out. As soon as like Logan was dead, it was like Logan's girlfriend, back of the plane.
Get to the back, go to bed. We'll get your important. And then we see that kind of crew. I think others have kind of used this term, so I'm not trying to claim credit for it. But the kind of Shakespearean the B cast that pop up in those different plays, and they're there for comic relief or a bit of drama every now and then. They decide, hey, it's kind of us. It's us working together, and they've even got Frank on the ground liaising with the kids. They're moving really quickly and really efficiently, and I feel like that does. I think we'll get into this later on in this episode when we talk about what happens next, but it does create a new battleground, which is the kids versus this half a dozen strong group of execs, which is pretty interesting.
And they are managing it in a smart way, even the way they deal with the kids, sending Hugo in to console the kids, but also check in on them and see what they're doing, make sure they're not doing anything that's going to tank.
And he keeps coming up to sort of listen. He's like, you guys want some water? Like, what are you guys up to?
Yeah, they've definitely got some kind of plan in place.
Any thoughts, Thomas, on what this means for, in an immediate sense, other characters? Like, we see Tom, basically, he's there. He's sort of quite central to it. But then when it becomes clear that Logan's dead, he seems like he's stressing out because he's no longer got a relationship with Shiv.
Yeah, he's lost his protector in Logan. This was kind of like Tom's time to shine, and the only thing he wasn't banking on was like Logan having a heart attack on the plane. So it's going to be interesting for Tom, and he does seem a bit panicked. Also, that was really weird, that scene where, like, I mean, again, another Tom and Greg light episode, which is fine, but they have that conversation where he calls, Tom calls Greg, and basically he's like, it's Christmas Day, there's a dead man at the bottom of your stocking, but can you also go to ATN? And he's been tasked with basically firing Sid, and also like, can you get that folder of marked logistics on my desktop and delete it, and then delete it from the deleted trash? So like, there's something weird going on there. Obviously, Tom is in like a bit of a panic stations mode, and it's kind of unclear if he'll be swept up into the Frank and Carl team. And obviously, we then see him also, like, as much as they're going through a divorce, he and Shiv are still married. He's still an emotional support for her, and they end the episode leaving in a car together. So it's going to be curious to see like which side he falls on. But it's impossible to tell, I think, who is going to emerge now and like what we're supposed to be rooting for, because you've got this B team, like you said, and like, do we feel strongly for like Frank and Carl and Carolina had to Google during the episode.
Obviously, even though the show's called Succession, we've been talking so much about what it means when Logan goes. The fact that when he does go,
there is no succession.
I was
plan.
Surprised by how many of these, like the relationship dynamics preset, I guess.
I guess it's also because we've been positioned to see Logan as someone who can't die. It's the way that all his kids talk about him. As Furman said, he's a monster. He's not going to die. And so you kind of don't even play the end game out. You don't have the theories or the exact machinations of how it will work. And so it is kind of surprising, especially when he dies in the way that he does, just out of nowhere in the air.
Yeah, what do we think about the decision that I think most of us thought that they wouldn't save a potential death like this for the very end because we want to see the consequences play out. But episode 3 out of 10 is pretty early. What do you think about that, Thomas?
I mean, I think massive respect to the creators. I think it's like a huge play. And now, with like the benefit of hindsight, I think it's a great play because you've now got, whatever, 7 remaining episodes for us to watch the fallout. Again, it was hard knowing, like going into the episode, what was possibly going to happen. But I think it has set it up in such a nice way. And I thought it was so, like, had you known Logan was going to die in this episode, you would expect some massive emotional arc, some like another stirring speech. But he says like maybe 20 words in this episode. Like we got the big speech last week. He had his big, like last week, Logan was like best on ground MVP. And this week it was nothing. Like even his last line is just like a few instructions to Tom and that's it. And then like like Meg said before, we don't even see the death. We just see him on the floor. Like it was such a kind of, I don't know, a undignified death for a larger than life character, but then it had to be that way. Like if you had given Logan a final moment, it just wouldn't have felt true to like the Succession canon.
I also feel like Logan probably would have liked the way he died. And I know that he died essentially in a toilet on a plane. But
like your favorite guy, Elvis.
Exactly. Good enough for him. But I mean, he went out swinging. He was talking about knifing Sid, knifing Jerry. He's always said life is like a fight in the mud with a knife. So that's exactly what he was doing. And he was doing business. In the first episode of Succession, Logan didn't respect that Kendall had chosen to come to his birthday party. And he wanted him to go out and close some deal. And that's exactly what Logan was doing. He wasn't at his son's wedding. He was doing business, getting deals done, knifing people in the mud. And he just went out swinging. He probably would have liked it.
Yeah, I think the last thing I want to say about the decision to have him go out in this way is that the death was always going to be a huge moment for the show. Doing it in episode 3 is a surprise and quite a shock. But the show's creators didn't just rely on that moment of his death as a kind of gimmick to get us to be all shocked and like, oh my God, what have they done? This is such a bold move. The actual physical death of Logan is dealt with pretty quickly. What most of the show sits on for this entire episode is the emotional and kind of business and real world fallout. And that is tricky to do when you could have just had an episode set at a wedding and then Logan dies at the end of it and it's a cliffhanger and then you pick things up. That would have been a fine way to do it. It would have been the easy way to do it. These guys took the hard way and it was so much more rewarding. And I think all like that scene with all 4 of the siblings when they finally remember that Connor exists and they kind of loop him in. All 4 of those actors could get an Emmy. Like it was an extraordinary performance.
I think it's rather telling that Logan would rather die than go to Connor's wedding, which is kind of sums up Connor pretty much. But yeah, I think I saw an article before. It was like, how long exactly did it take until the siblings told Connor Roy? It was like 15 minutes and 54 seconds or something. I mean, that whole scene, again, this was an episode of very few flaws, but watching Kendall and Shiv go hand in hand and they kind of just like let the shot linger of the two of them holding hands before they go and tell Connor. And then Connor was so heartbreaking, like when he's like, he never liked me anyway. And then he kind of catches himself pretty quickly and doesn't, there's not too much self-pity, but yeah, you got to feel for Connor. We haven't even spoken about him in this pod, which tells you a lot, but he ends up getting married at the end of the episode.
Not to step on a later segment, but he's like my winner in this episode. He dealt with the emotional fallout of his dad dying pretty well, and then he got married to the love of his life. Good result for him.
Love of his life. Huge asterisk on that.
This is, I think, a good opportunity to talk about TV deaths in general, because this one did something special, but it reminded me of a few others. And television deaths, sometimes they're great, sometimes they make you really angry, sometimes they're shocking, and sometimes they kill way more people than you thought a show like Grey's Anatomy would ever do. Meg, tell me what makes a TV death good.
I think it depends on the death. And this one feels very different to a lot of the big ones I think people would think of. So the first, when you think of big TV deaths in recent years especially, I think the Red Wedding kind of comes to mind on Game of Thrones, especially this being a wedding. It's a pretty nice parallel. But I think what made that so shocking was that kind of physical presence, people bringing out knives and knifing people's pregnant bellies and just having like a full-on slaughter. It's the shock of it that gets people talking. And especially, I mean, this episode will have shock for a lot of people. Not everyone like us has this weird backstory with HBO.
And Nicholas Braun sort of hinting at shock.
Not everyone can be personal friends with Nicholas Braun, sure. So I think a big thing that catches people with these big death moments on TV is the shock. And so the Red Wedding came to mind. Also with Grey's Anatomy, I'm a longtime fan of Grey's Anatomy, and a lot of people have died in that show. But what I thought of also was the episode, there's a shooter in the hospital, and they kill like half the cast in one go.
Yeah.
And it comes out of nowhere. You have no idea what to expect, and it's just this intense trauma. And it's all in the moment. You're seeing people with blood on the floor. This is entirely different. And I think that's what struck me. It's just the actual choice to not have those final moments, to not see all of even Logan's body or face. You don't even see his face at all when he's on the ground. It did remind me of another death that's like that, though, for any fans of The Good Wife.
Great show. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. Brilliant stuff.
It's so good. So there was a character in that called Will. He was the love interest of the main character, Alicia Florrick, and his death comes out, also spoilers for a number of shows. His death comes out of absolutely nowhere. There's no foreshadowing. He gets shot in a courtroom, but you actually don't see it. You don't see that active violence. You learn about it from his longtime love interest, who's kind of not with him anymore, getting a phone call and learning about it in that way. And there's actually a parallel where she had left him a voicemail, kind of like Roman does at the start of this episode, where they're fighting and she doesn't know if he's received it. And I think there's a lot of relatable energy in that kind of way you experience deaths in real life, where you're not there most of the time. You know, if you don't see someone get shot, you don't see someone have the heart attack. You just get this weird phone call and you're trying to gather information and you're trying to get to the hospital. And that's awkward and it's weird. And I think what makes this episode so great is that it just sits in it. I think I heard the director of this episode in particular say he wanted the camera to be almost sadistic in the way that it lingers on you. And the fact that he does that for 40 minutes of the episode is grueling, but great.
Thomas, you're a big Grey's Anatomy head as well. Are there deaths from that show that make you think about what we've just experienced?
Maybe not in the same style, but I am still kind of processing the loss of Derek Shepherd, McDreamy. Meg, you get it. That was so heartbreaking. I feel like I invested a lot of my like young kind of teenage energy into Meredith and Derek. I was like really on board with their love story, and then they just fucking killed him. He has a car accident, and then to make matters worse, he's like, she's
he gets
pregnant.
hit by a truck.
Yeah, he gets hit by a truck, aggressive, and then she's also pregnant with his child. So it's like, obviously the actor really like annoyed Shonda Rhimes, and she was like, I'm going to make it as traumatic as possible. But she also like, I mean, that show does have a lot of deaths. Like, do you remember Denny Duquette, that death? Like,
I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
I mean,
You do. It's your only reference. That's the How to Save a Life one.
Oh,
Yes.
right. I was going to, yeah, okay. I do. I remember the era where a lot of ads for this show played the phrase "How to Save a Life."
it was a good time. It was a really good time for the fray, actually.
I was going to say you could play that song over like a montage of like Kendall and Roman on the phone crying, and it would kind of it was very soapy, a lot of the stuff in the show, but like really elevated. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously, like, I think there's not someone who, like, if you're an aging millennial and you're not still thinking about Marissa Cooper, then there's something wrong with you.
yeah, for me, the death that affected me the most in television is Adriana in The Sopranos, just because you thought, as bad as these guys are, and as much as Adriana has, from their perspective, done the wrong thing by becoming a mole for the FBI, they're not going to kill her. Like, they're not going to, Silvio's not going to, sorry, again, spoilers for
I mean, if you haven't crossed The Sopranos by now, then you deserve all the spoilers.
I agree. They're not going to shoot her to death, and they do. The death that felt structurally the most similar to what we just experienced with Succession, it's actually from Netflix's House of Cards season 2, when Zoe, played by Kate Mara, is killed in the opening episode of the second season. So you think, okay, cool, we're back for the show. Here we go again. It's Frank Cards and Zoe, and this is going to be great. And then she's dead. And it's like, what does this mean for the next like 15 episodes of this show? And I'm thinking about this now. It's like, I'm really excited to see the next couple of eps of where they take this. But the fact that there's 7 and that the writing has been so tight and good this season, I'm buzzing with excitement. Like, they're going to do so much with what they've created. I can't even really comprehend it. Like, we're entering a new world, and the fact that we're getting that at the end of this show's run is super exciting to me. All right, let's discuss our best lines, which is a slightly odd segment for this episode because it wasn't super comedic. There were a few gags at the start, and then it's basically an emotional gut punch for 15 minutes. Meg, do you go with something emotional, something fun? What did you choose?
I chose a bit of both. So, I mean, also, I think you guys picked the best lines and you got infer. But that's okay. I think I chose when Roman answers the phone when he picks up Tom's call about his dad dying, and he says, "Hello, fucky sucky brigade. How can I help you?" And then immediately has to change tact. It's a real capsule of what Succession is, with the tragedy and comedy all in one. And especially when he has to recount it later, Connor says, "Tell me exactly what happened." And Roman says, "Okay, I said, hello, fucky sucky brigade." And then Tom said he died in the bathroom or something to that effect. It's pretty tragic, but funny too.
Yeah, it's also weirdly relatable. Like, maybe not in that exact scenario, but I've definitely answered a call in a kind of comedic way. And the person's like, no, this is very serious stuff. You're in trouble. Thomas, what did you go with?
I went with one from Frank, not unusual in this segment, but I just thought it was very funny as they were like, things were kind of, the dust was slowly settling and they were figuring out what to tell Matsson because obviously, this meeting still has to be dealt with in some way. And so someone suggests saying, "Why don't we, let's not tell Matsson that Logan has died. We'll just say he's delayed." And Frank turns to him and goes, "He's heavily delayed." And I just thought that was like so perfect because, again, it's such a Succession line where it's like, this insane situation is happening to these crazy people, and it's just like dripping in sarcasm. And the fact that he just says, like, yeah, he's heavily delayed, like, yeah, he's going to be delayed forever, basically. I thought that was perfect. And the way he delivered it, I actually think Frank is massively underrated. This was like a big Frank episode. He did really well.
It was a big Frank episode. Frank's making moves, man.
Big time.
Mine was kind of towards the end of the episode when they're talking about the funeral, and Kendall says super dryly, like, "We'll just do Reagan's with tweaks," which is so good, so sharp.
I think he also describes it, "We'll just do an off-the-shelf funeral."
Off the rack.
Off the rack.
Next segment is Jerry Watch, which we spent a bit of time on in the earlier bit of this episode. Essentially, the episode starts with Jerry about to get fired. She ends up basically kind of getting fired by Roman, and by the end of things, she's kind of in charge, calling the shots. I think she'll be a significant character. I think it's a situation where it's an open world in terms of who gets to rise from here on in. And I think Jerry's going to be a key part of that. So, like I said before, good on us for picking her as one to watch.
It's
where
so
the
funny.
real win is.
Exactly. It's so funny though, because Roman's in a weird situation now because he's obviously just given her the bullet. He can't really go to anyone and be like, "Oh no, I promise, like Logan told me to fire her." She's the only one that kind of knows. So he's like cooked himself with her, and she was so ice cold. That was also another heartbreaking moment when he was like, "I'm feeling really sad," or I can't remember how he phrased it, but basically
This is
like,
really hard for me to do. Yeah, it was really intense.
Yeah, and she was just like nothing. And then even when Logan died, she gave him like nothing. So he's kind of going to be in this weird scenario where he's just fired the CEO, who's like unfired now, and yeah, like the world is really Jerry's oyster right now, which is kind of what we wanted all along.
Over to Fun Fact Corner. So this is one that I learned from these little vignettes that they release after every episode. You can watch them on YouTube. They're sort of a bit of a behind the scenes. And Mark Mylod, the executive producer and one of the regular directors of this, was talking about how they actually shot that really, really long, heart-wrenching scene with all the siblings coming together. Originally, it was different takes and different setups over the course of 4 to 5 days. They each shot the reactions to, they shot each of the siblings' reactions quite separately. And then the plan was to stitch that all together. And then Mark Mylod says that Kieran Culkin had this idea. Kieran Culkin says it was Mark's idea. I think no one wants to take credit for it because it seemed to be really punishing, where in one day they filmed 28 pages of the script, which is extremely rare. That's nearly half an hour of real world, what we see on screen in one act, basically, where they just did the whole on the boat, the siblings finding out, interacting with one another, dragging Shiv in, dragging Connor in one day. And they used most of that filming for what we eventually saw on screen. It's such a rare and risky thing for them to do. But you hear these interviews in the same video on YouTube where the actor's Alan Ruck, who plays Connor, talking about how being able to riff on the emotion of the other actors is what really created that magic. And when you've got that many great actors with the great writing and the great directing, you let them all cook. It's kind of no surprise that all of us really got sucked in and started getting really emotional for the death of one of the worst villains in TV history.
I think it also creates such good opportunity for this. Like seeing how they physically interact in that space is really interesting. Even when they're telling Connor about the details of what went down, and Roman goes to give him a hug, but doesn't really know how to give a hug, and so he just like grabs his arm and like hugs his bottom under his elbow. Like that's such a great choice, and you wouldn't have had that. As good as it is to have the kind of dislocation that Succession always does, and you have people in different locations and the phone lines crackling and there's a tension there, I think having the kids all together does bring so much more to it.
All right, let's get into our winners and losers. Meg, do you want to go first?
3 points to Jerry. She started this episode getting fired and is now in the most secure position of anyone. It's a pretty good job.
Fair point.
I gave 2 points also to Lucas Matson because that stock price has tumbled and he might get a pretty good discount deal.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but that makes a lot of sense.
I don't know if that's how it works, but he's in a good negotiating spot.
We're slowly learning about business.
Yeah.
Yeah, episode by episode.
I also gave a point to Marsha because she just got some extra shopping money for Milan. She's still technically married.
And who's your loser?
It's Logan. I mean, I think he's got to be the big loser.
That is rough.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, okay. Yes.
He couldn't have predicted. I think as much as I said he went out the way he would want to, I think he didn't want to go out and he was scared of dying, and it proves he's human all along, which is a loss.
I guess if you're dead, you're a loser. Thomas, what have you got for us?
So wise. I went Jerry winner as well because of very similar reasons to what Meg just said. I feel like she's in pole position, but controversially, I gave Roman 2 points, even though it seems like he's kind of like revealed his hand with having to fire Jerry. He got out of basically backstabbing the siblings without them ever finding out. Like, we don't know if they will find out. I think maybe they won't. So right now he's kind of like still in with the siblings, but he kind of has an inside track still. So I think if it does become a situation where the siblings eat each other, I think Roman will come out on top. And then I gave 1 point each to Shiv and Kendall because I just thought, they lost their dad. They seem to be handling okay. But my big loser was Kerry, which I said before brought me great joy. She really irritated me the whole season, and just like how quickly that like facade of like that proximity to power faded away. I found that so satisfying, and I suspect we won't see her again the entire season.
Yeah, Kerry is my loser as well. She's so obviously out. She had all of her eggs in the Logan basket, and that basket is smashed to bits.
I think the kids will also really resent her that she got more time with them, and there'll be that tension there as well.
Totally. There was that line, which is, Dad spoke to Kerry for a bit. The fact that she got to talk to him when they didn't. I already flagged my winner was Connor. Like, he seemed to be emotionally fine after the death of his dad, who didn't really love him, and he got married, and seemed like a nice ceremony. Had a nice chat to Willow about the terms of their marriage. So it was actually
almost romantic where they landed.
It was the closest thing. I think I've said this before to you guys, that the closest thing to what a good, in quotation marks, relationship looks like on this show, which is very honest and transactional. Willow, are you in it for the money? Well, it's a big part of it, but I'm also pretty happy. Well, that's good enough for me. Let's go get married. Shiv, I gave 2 points because I think her leading that press conference and responding to that question and basically re-injecting the siblings into this conversation about what happens next was quite effective. And Tom gets 1 point just because he was making some moves with Greg about what he wants to do next. So our ranking, Tom still at the top, but Roman is edging up. He's only 1 point behind. Shiv is just behind them, and Jerry, thanks to you guys chucking some points, is right up there too. So this is getting fun. Last but not least, folks, and I think this may be the hardest episode to do predictions in because really everything has just been cast wide open. My one is based on how this week's episode ended. We see the siblings, after spending most of the episode together in the same room, they actually end it in very different places. So Kendall is sort of standing on his own, looking pretty upset. Roman has gone to inspect the body or to kind of be close to his dad. And Shiv is driving off with Tom. Now, that could just be an interesting way to sort of show how they are all reacting differently. but I think it might foreshadow that we're going to see that unity that we've seen this entire season fracture a little bit. What do you think, Meg? What's going to happen? You think I'm totally wrong, don't you?
Yeah, I do. My only prediction is that they will stay together. Not for the whole rest of the season, because again, there's 7 episodes, but I like 2 to 3 eps of sibling strength, I think, is coming our way. And especially, like Thomas said, that moment with Kendall and Shiv holding hands and the way the camera lingers. You get so many of those moments throughout, even if they end in separate places. You know, they had that hug on the tarmac. The best hug they've ever had, a successful above the elbow hug. And even the way that Kendall and Roman were roasting each other before that press conference, like, we're going to be okay. Not you, though. You're fine. Like, that's very loving. That's how they know how to love each other. And I think that's enough to keep them together for a bit. And especially if they're coming up against this Frank and Hugo and Jerry
Frank,
alliance.
Hugo, Jerry alliance is great.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to be a united front for a little while longer. I think Tom's a good question of what's going to happen there, because, you know, which side will he fall on and how does that affect the kids? With Shiv being so vulnerable, could she get peeled away because of that? I don't know what's going on there, but I think the kids will stick together for a little bit.
What about you, Thomas? Predictions?
Yeah, I think ultimately Succession is a show that it's never going to be like the take-home message is never going to be that like love conquers all, and these 3 siblings, as much, you know, they've had to go through hardships, this, you know, tragedy has brought them together and they're going to take on the Jerry crew and blah, blah, blah. It's not going to happen. Like the ultimate message, I think, will be that Logan, even from beyond the grave, he's embedded in them this like thirst for power, and so they will kind of pick each other apart. I reckon it'll happen pretty quickly. I reckon based on like the signs that have been posted so far, Roman is having the most curious journey this season. I reckon Roman is going to win Succession. Finn.
Wow, big call. Before we ran out the episode, it was interesting reading Brian Cox. He did a bunch of interviews with a few different outlets in the lead up to this episode coming out. And he's asked, like, who do you think will win? He's like, oh, I don't really know. But the one thing I will say is I don't think that this story is about these kids succeeding. I think this is a story about how useless and terrible these kids are. So that'll be a really interesting one to watch. Thanks so much, Thomas and Meg. This Succession recap episode of The Drop was produced by Ruby Schwartz. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode of The Drop, make sure to follow us in your favorite podcast app. Give us a review, or better yet, share it with a friend. I'm Osman Faruqi. See you next week.